In the winter of 2021, a trail camera mounted to a pine tree in Elko County, Nevada, captured something that wildlife biologists initially looked at twice. Not because the image was unclear. The image was clear enough. They looked twice because what was in it was not supposed to be there. Two gray wolves, a large male and a slightly smaller animal moving behind him, were walking through a narrow corridor between snowfields. If what you just heard makes you want to keep going, stay here. This is exactly the kind of content we make, and there is a lot more of it. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. Their tracks pressing deep into the crust, their bodies unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Gray wolves. In Nevada, a state where the last confirmed wolf sighting before that moment had occurred, depending on which record you consulted, somewhere between the 1920s and the 1930s. A state where the wolf had been gone, functionally and literally, for nearly a century. The footage did not cause an immediate public sensation. It moved through the wildlife biology community first, carefully, the way significant but complicated findings tend to move through communities that understand exactly how significant and how complicated they are. Then it reached the broader conservation world, where it produced the kind of cautious excitement that people who have spent careers working on large carnivore recovery feel when the animal they have been watching, spread slowly across a landscape, finally crosses a boundary that nobody expected it to cross this soon. And then it reached the general public, where it produced a collision of reactions that revealed, in compressed form, every major tension that has defined the human relationship with gray wolves in North America for the past 4 decades. If you find this kind of story worth following, the kind where an animal does something that rewrites what we thought we knew about where it is and where it is going, consider subscribing. This is exactly what we cover. The gray wolf's return to Nevada is a story about ecology and geography and the quiet persistence of an animal moving through terrain on its own terms without consulting the maps that humans have drawn for it. But it is also a story about what the wolf's presence means, and what presence itself means when you are talking about an animal that has been treated as a symbol, a threat, a conservation success, a political flashpoint, and an ecological necessity all at once, often by people standing in the same room. To understand what the cameras in Elko County actually captured, and why it matters in ways that go well beyond the borders of Nevada, you have to start further back. You have to start with what Nevada was before the wolf disappeared, and with what the wolf's disappearance meant for a landscape that had been built over thousands of years, with the wolf included. The Great Basin is one of the most misunderstood landscapes in North America. It is misunderstood partly because it is large and difficult to traverse, and does not produce the kind of scenic drama that draws visitors and photographers and documentary crews in the numbers that the Rocky Mountains or the Pacific Coast do. It is misunderstood partly because its name suggests something that it is not quite. The Great Basin is not a single basin. It is a collection of hundreds of internal drainage basins, separated by north-south trending mountain ranges, a geological formation called basin and range topography that covers most of Nevada, significant portions of Utah, and pieces of California, Oregon, Idaho, and Wyoming. Between those mountain ranges, which top out in many places above 10,000 feet, and in some places above 12,000, the valleys are high desert, cold in winter, dry in all seasons, visually austere in a way that takes time to read correctly. The landscape does not announce its richness. It holds it close. The richness is real. The Great Basin supports significant populations of mule deer, pronghorn antelope, elk in certain mountain ranges, bighorn sheep on the rocky escarpments, and a supporting cast of smaller prey species that includes jackrabbits, cottontails, ground squirrels, and birds in numbers that make some of the valley system's important stopover points for migrating raptors. The predator community that historically worked this landscape included mountain lions, black bears in the wetter and more forested ranges, coyotes everywhere, and gray wolves. The wolves were not present in the kind of densities that characterized the northern Rockies or the Great Lakes region. The Great Basin is not prime wolf habitat in the sense that a biologist designing a wolf reintroduction program from scratch would select it as a target ecosystem. The prey base is patchier, the terrain is more demanding, the water is scarcer. But wolves were here. They moved through the mountain ranges and the valleys between them. They were part of the predator guild that shaped how deer and pronghorn moved, where they fed, which drainages they used, and which they avoided. They were doing the work that wolves do in every ecosystem they inhabit, a work that turns out to be more consequential and more structurally important than anyone understood until it was gone. The removal of wolves from the American West was not a gradual process driven by habitat loss or disease or the kinds of forces that produce slow species declines. It was deliberate. It was systematic. It was funded by federal and state governments with the explicit goal of eliminating the species from the landscape. The Biological Survey, which later became part of the Fish and Wildlife Service, employed professional hunters and trappers whose job was to kill wolves. They used traps, poison, guns, and in some cases, denning, the practice of digging out wolf dens and killing the pups. The campaign was effective. It produced results with the efficiency of an industrial process. By the 1930s, wolves were functionally gone from the contiguous United States south of the Great Lakes and east of a small remnant population in Minnesota. They were gone from Nevada before most people who are alive today were born. The landscape that remained after their removal was not the same landscape, but the change was slow enough, and the baseline shift was old enough that the altered state became the reference condition. The Nevada that wildlife managers and ranchers and hunters knew was a Nevada without wolves. That was the normal. That was what the land was supposed to look like. The science of what happens to ecosystems when apex predators are removed and then returned has been one of the most dynamic and contested areas of ecology for the past 30 years. And its contestation is not simply political, though it is that too. It is scientifically genuine in ways that deserve honest acknowledgement. The concept of trophic cascades, the idea that predators exert effects that ripple down through multiple levels of the food web in ways that restructure plant communities, stream geomorphology, and species compositions far removed from the direct predator-prey relationship, was a marginal hypothesis when it first appeared in the scientific literature. It became dramatically less marginal after the gray wolf reintroduction to Yellowstone National Park in 1995. Yellowstone had been without wolves since the 1920s. By the early 1990s, the park's northern elk herd was large, widely distributed, and grazing the riparian areas along the Lamar River and its tributaries with a thoroughness that had stripped the willows and aspens from the streamside, altered the hydrology of the stream channels, and produced conditions that ecologists described as overgrazing, without using the political baggage that word carries in livestock contexts. When wolves were reintroduced, the changes that followed were initially what ecologists expected. Wolves killed elk. The elk herd declined in size and redistributed spatially in ways that reflected their response to predation risk. The heavily grazed riparian areas began to recover as elk avoided spending extended time in open, stream-adjacent terrain where they were vulnerable. Willows grew back. Aspens regenerated. Songbird populations that depended on riparian vegetation increased. Beaver, which had been locally scarce, expanded their range as the willow stands they needed for food and dam construction returned. Beaver dams changed water table dynamics. Stream channels narrowed and deepened. The river system began to behave differently than it had during the 60-year absence of wolves. The word that got attached to this process was trophic cascade. The more evocative phrase that entered popular circulation was the wolves changed the rivers. Both descriptions are accurate in different senses and misleading in different ways. The trophic cascade is real. The mechanism is more complicated than popular accounts suggest, and the magnitude of the wolf effect relative to other factors, including drought, elk population dynamics, vegetation management, and the presence of other predators like bears and mountain lions, has been the subject of genuine scientific debate that the most enthusiastic popular accounts of Yellowstone's restoration have not always engaged honestly. But the core of the finding holds. Wolves changed the behavior of elk, and changed elk behavior changed the landscape in ways that were measurable, significant, and in most respects ecologically positive. The scientific community largely accepts this. The magnitude and the generalizability are what remain in discussion. What Yellowstone demonstrated, whatever the precise calibration of its effects, was that the wolf's functional role in the ecosystems from which it had been removed was not simply decorative or symbolic, it was structural. The wolf was not just a predator that killed prey animals and could be replaced in that narrow function by hunting pressure or other predators. It was a presence whose spatial influence over the entire prey population, the fear effect that drove elk off riverbeds and out of vulnerable terrain, could not be replicated by any other force in the current landscape. The mountain lion kills elk too. Hunters kill elk too. Neither mountain lions nor hunters produce the same landscape-scale redistribution of ungulate behavior that wolves do, because neither mountain lion nor hunter exists for elk as the same kind of omnipresent spatial threat. Mountain lions are ambush predators that elk have evolved behavioral responses to that differ from their responses to coursing predators, like wolves. Hunters are temporally bounded, existing as a threat for defined seasons rather than all year. The wolf's effect on elk and deer behavior is different in kind, not just degree, and that difference in kind cascades through the ecosystem in ways that matter. This is the ecological context into which the wolves in Elko County arrived in 2021. They arrived into a landscape from which their functional role had been absent for nearly a century. A landscape that had been reorganized around their absence, that had reached a new equilibrium, built on the assumption that the apex predator position in the local wolf guild was permanently vacant. A landscape that is not Yellowstone, that does not have the prey density or the specific topography or the management infrastructure of a national park, but that is also not ecologically inert. It is a landscape with mule deer and elk and pronghorn and bighorn sheep and all the vegetation communities those species interact with, and it has been operating without the influence of a coursing apex predator for a very long time. Where did the Elko County wolves come from? This is the question that wildlife biologists set about answering with the tools available to them after the trail camera footage emerged, and the answer they pieced together is itself a story worth telling because it reveals something important about how wolf recovery works and how it does not work. Gray wolves in the northern Rockies have been expanding their range southward and westward from the Yellowstone reintroduction population and from the naturally recovering populations in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming for years. The process has been documented by GPS collar data, trail camera captures, genetic samples from scat and hare, and occasional confirmed kill sites. Oregon established a breeding population. California began recording confirmed wolf presence in the mid-2010s, most prominently with the lone male wolf known as OR7, who crossed from Oregon into California in 2011, followed years later by the Shasta Pack and then the Lassen Pack, which became the first confirmed breeding wolf pack in California since the 1920s. The wolves were moving along the mountain ranges and river drainages that form the connective tissue of the West, following elk and deer into new territory, establishing territories and then producing offspring that dispersed further. The wolves documented in Elko County are almost certainly dispersers from the Oregon or Idaho populations, moving along corridors that include the Snake River Plain and the mountain ranges that form Nevada's northern and eastern border. They are following the same logic that all dispersing wolves follow, moving away from established pack territories into terrain where prey exists and competition from resident wolves does not. Nevada's mountain ranges, particularly in the north and northeast of the state, offer exactly that kind of terrain. There are elk, there are mule deer, there are no resident wolves, and have not been for nearly a century. From the perspective of a young wolf looking for somewhere to go, it is an attractive proposition. The documentation of these animals required the kind of sustained, unglamorous fieldwork that wildlife monitoring depends on. Trail cameras placed along game trails and water sources, checked seasonally, in terrain that is not easily accessed. Scat samples sent to genetics laboratories where mitochondrial DNA and microsatellite markers are used to identify species, sex, and individual identity, and to connect individuals to source populations. Tracks measured and photographed in conditions that allow confident species identification. The process is painstaking, expensive, and produces data that accumulates slowly. The confirmation that Nevada was hosting gray wolves in 2021 was not a single moment of revelation. It was the convergence of multiple independent data streams that, taken together, eliminated the alternative explanations and left wolf as the only conclusion that fit all of the evidence. The Nevada Department of Wildlife, known in the state as INDAO, occupies a position of institutional delicacy on the wolf question that is characteristic of wildlife agencies in states that have not historically had wolves and where wolf recovery is not universally welcomed by the agricultural and ranching communities that have significant influence over wildlife policy. Nevada is a state where the livestock industry, while not as dominant economically as it once was, retains considerable political influence, and where the cultural relationship between ranchers and apex predators that eat cattle and sheep has a history that is long and uncomplicated in exactly one direction. The wolf has not been gone from Nevada so long that the memory of what its presence meant to livestock operators has faded entirely. The institutional memory, carried in ranching families and in the agricultural organizations that represent them, holds that wolves are a problem and that their return is not a conservation success, but a management failure. Doe has tried to navigate this in the way that wildlife agencies typically navigate the arrival of a federally protected species in a state that has politically mixed feelings about it, which is to say, carefully and with extensive documentation of existing regulatory frameworks and jurisdictional boundaries. The gray wolf is listed as an endangered species under the Federal Endangered Species Act in the continental United States, except in the western Great Lakes states, where it has been delisted and relisted through a series of legal battles that are not yet resolved. In Nevada, any gray wolf present is federally protected, which means that NDO's options in managing the species are constrained by federal law in ways that state wildlife managers sometimes chafe against, regardless of their personal views on wolf recovery. The agency cannot authorize wolf control, cannot permit wolf hunting, and is limited to monitoring, documentation, and coordination with federal partners. This is not a comfortable position for an agency that is accustomed to having management authority over the wildlife within its borders, and the discomfort is real even when the people within the agency are personally supportive of wolf recovery. The ranching community's response to the confirmed wolf presence in Nevada has followed a pattern established in every other Western state that has experienced wolf recolonization. It has not been uniformly hostile. There are ranchers in Nevada, a smaller number than the organizations that claim to represent them might suggest, who are cautiously willing to see how the wolf's presence plays out before mobilizing against it. There are ranchers who have dealt with wolves in neighboring states through the compensation programs and range riders and non-lethal deterrent strategies that have been developed over 20 years of wolf-livestock conflict management in Idaho, Oregon, and Montana, and who understand that the situation is manageable, even if it is not welcome. But the louder voice, the voice that reaches state legislatures and federal congressional delegations and agency directors, is the voice that describes the wolf's return as an existential threat to the livestock industry and demands management tools, which is the language used when people want to be able to kill wolves that federal law does not currently permit. The livestock predation concern is not fabricated. Wolves kill cattle and sheep. They kill them more often in some landscapes and management styles than others. And the rate of depredation in areas where wolves have been established for years tends to be lower than the projections made before wolves arrive. Because livestock operators who have worked with range riders and guardian dogs and other deterrents have reduced their losses, and because wolves that have access to abundant wild prey typically prefer it to the elevated risk that comes with attacking domestic animals that are often guarded or in close proximity to humans. But the losses happen. They are real losses, with real economic consequences for individual ranch operations, particularly smaller family operations, with fewer animals to absorb losses from. The compensation programs that exist in most wolf states, funded through a combination of federal and state sources and in some cases private conservation funding, cover confirmed depredations, but not unconfirmed losses. And the gap between confirmed and likely total losses is a source of genuine frustration among ranchers who find the confirmation standard difficult to meet when a dead calf has been partially consumed and dragged into terrain that makes physical evidence collection difficult. The political dynamics of wolf recovery in Nevada are shaped by the state's unusual dual identity as a state with a large, largely wild rural landscape and a population that is concentrated overwhelmingly in two urban centers, Las Vegas and Reno. The people of Las Vegas and Reno, who constitute the vast majority of Nevada's voters, are demographically and culturally distant from the ranching communities of Elko and White Pine and Humboldt counties in a way that produces a genuine representational tension in wildlife policy. Urban Nevada voters, to the extent that wolf recovery crosses their awareness at all, tend to be supportive of it in the abstract, in the way that surveys consistently show urban Americans to be broadly supportive of large carnivore conservation. Rural Nevada voters, particularly in the counties where wolves are or might be present, are broadly less supportive. The state legislature, which is not uniformly aligned with the urban majority on wildlife issues, has been a venue for expressions of concern about federal wolf management that reflect the rural constituency's views more than the statewide populations. This is not unique to Nevada. It is the political geography of wolf recovery across the American West, and it has produced a pattern in which federal policy, driven by legal requirements, and the political influence of conservation advocacy organizations at the national level frequently diverges from state policy preferences in the places where wolves actually live. The Endangered Species Act is a federal law that creates federal management authority over listed species regardless of state preferences, and the wolf's recovery story across the West has been shaped as much by federal court decisions as by any biological reality on the ground. The repeated attempts to delist the gray wolf in the northern Rockies, the legal challenges to those delistings, The congressional rider that achieved delisting by legislative rather than regulatory action in 2011 and the subsequent litigation over the boundaries of the delisted area have produced a regulatory environment of remarkable complexity that wildlife managers in wolf presence states navigate with varying degrees of difficulty and varying degrees of grace. The wolves in Elko County exist within this regulatory environment. They are federally protected. Their presence is documented. Their origin is understood with reasonable genetic confidence. And the question of what happens next is one that is being answered not by a single decision-maker or a single agency, but by the interaction of federal law, state management preferences, livestock industry political pressure, conservation advocacy, and the wolves themselves, who are operating on an entirely different set of priorities from all of the above. What the wolves themselves are doing is what wolves always do when they move into new territory and find conditions that meet their basic needs. They are hunting. The prey base in the mountain ranges of northeastern Nevada includes elk populations that have been managed for decades as a hunting resource, and that are, in the absence of wolves, subject to the same kinds of behavioral diffusion that characterized Yellowstone's northern range elk herd before reintroduction. They feed where it is convenient. They spend time in riparian areas without the constant spatial anxiety that wolf presence induces. They graze at densities and for durations that, in some areas, produce the overgrazing of streamside vegetation that ecologists recognize as the functional signature of a missing apex predator. Two wolves, or a small number of wolves, in a landscape this large will not produce the dramatic behavioral shift that 21 wolves produced in Yellowstone's relatively contained northern range. The scale is different, the prey density is different, the topography is different, but the direction of the effect, if wolves establish themselves and the population grows, would be the same direction. Prey animals that have been operating in a wolf-free landscape for a century would begin operating in a landscape where the wolf is present again, and the behavioral and spatial consequences of that shift would begin to express themselves in the vegetation and the waterways and the smaller species that depend on them. The question of whether wolves will establish a breeding population in Nevada rather than simply passing through is the question that determines the trajectory of everything else. A breeding pack is a categorically different presence from dispersing individuals. Dispersing individuals are ecologically interesting and biologically significant as evidence of range expansion and population health, but they do not produce the sustained predation pressure and spatial influence that a resident pack does. They move through. They may kill prey. They may eventually attract a mate and establish a territory, or they may continue moving, cross into Utah or California, or loop back north into Idaho, and the presence that seemed like the beginning of a recovery story turns out to have been a passing moment rather than a permanent change. The factors that determine whether dispersing wolves become a breeding population in new territory include prey availability, human tolerance, and the availability of other wolves as potential mates. The first condition is met in northeastern Nevada. The prey is there. The human tolerance question is more complicated. Wolves establish territories and breed successfully in landscapes where they are not persecuted, where the rate of human-caused mortality is low enough to allow population establishment. In a state where wolf presence is legally protected but politically contested, the practical question of what human-caused mortality rate wolves will experience is not answered by the law alone. It is answered by what actually happens on the ground, which depends on attitudes and behaviors that law enforcement cannot fully control and that vary enormously across the landscape. The availability of other wolves as mates is the most ecologically constraining factor in the short term. A single wolf, or two wolves of the same sex, cannot establish a breeding pack regardless of how suitable the habitat is. The documented trail camera footage of two animals is potentially significant, but not determinative. The sex of the documented animals was not confirmed with certainty from the footage alone. Genetic material from scat collected in the area of the camera captures was being analyzed by laboratory teams in the months following the initial documentation. The results of that analysis and subsequent monitoring would determine whether the animals documented represented a viable founding pair or simply two dispersers whose paths happened to cross in the same corridor at roughly the same time. The history of wolf recolonization in other states is not uniformly a story of smooth population establishment. Or 7. The Oregon wolf, whose journey into California made him briefly one of the most famous animals in American conservation history, spent years wandering alone before he found a mate and established a pack. The Shasta pack formed and then lost members to mortality before its status became uncertain. Lone wolves traverse enormous distances and die alone without establishing the population expansion they seem to represent at the time of their documentation. The documented presence of wolves in a new state is a genuine biological event. It is not a guarantee of recovery. The gap between presence and recovery is filled by the messy, contingent, unpredictable process of individual animals finding mates and establishing territories and raising pups in landscapes where every one of those steps can be interrupted by vehicle collisions, illegal shooting, disease, or simple ecological misfortune. The vehicle collision risk is substantial and deserves specific attention because it is the human-caused mortality factor that operates most consistently, regardless of human attitudes toward wolf conservation. Nevada has thousands of miles of roads, including major interstate highways and two-lane state routes that traverse exactly the terrain that dispersing wolves travel. Wolves killed by vehicles in the West constitute a significant fraction of documented human-caused wolf mortality in states where reliable carcass reporting exists. A wolf moving at night through unfamiliar terrain does not avoid highways any more reliably than a deer does, and the result, when a wolf and a vehicle intersect on a two-lane road at speed, is the same as the result for any large mammal. The northern Rocky Mountain wolf populations have lost individuals to vehicle collisions repeatedly. In a state like Nevada, where wolves are a new presence and where the monitoring infrastructure to detect every mortality event does not yet exist, the true vehicle-caused mortality rate is unknown but not negligible. The illegal killing risk is the factor that wildlife managers in states with contentious wolf politics are most careful about discussing publicly, for reasons that are simultaneously understandable and frustrating. The colloquial term used for the practiced suppression of evidence when a politically unpopular predator is killed illegally is shoot, shovel, and shut up. It is not a term used by wildlife managers. It is a term used by people who engage in the practice and by the cultural communities that tolerate it, and it describes a reality that is documented in the confirmed mortality records of wolves in the northern Rockies, Oregon, and California across the past 3 decades. Of the wolves known to have died in those states from human causes other than vehicle collisions, a significant proportion died from gunshot wounds. Of the wolves that simply disappeared from GPS collar contact without recovered carcasses, a proportion whose exact size is genuinely unknown died from causes that were concealed rather than reported. The practice is a federal crime. It is prosecuted when evidence is available. The prosecutions that have occurred have not eliminated the practice. In a state like Nevada, where wolves have been absent for a century and where the cultural memory of predator control has not been complicated by decades of formal recovery effort, the tolerance for illegal killing is an unknown quantity. It may be lower than in states with longer histories of contentious wolf management, where the political hostility has had more time to accumulate and calcify. It may be higher in specific communities, with particularly intense historical relationships with predator control. It is a variable that wildlife managers cannot measure directly, and that shapes the trajectory of wolf recovery in ways that no amount of monitoring can fully account for after the fact. The genetic analysis of wolf material from Nevada has provided information that extends beyond the simple confirmation of wolf presence. The ability to assign individual wolves to source populations based on genetic markers has connected Nevada's wolves to the broader northern Rocky Mountain metapopulation in ways that illuminate the dispersal corridors that are allowing range expansion to occur. The mountain ranges of northeastern Nevada connect, through varying degrees of landscape permeability, to the ranges of southern Idaho, eastern Oregon, and northwestern Utah. These connections are not perfect. There are valleys and agricultural zones and road networks that wolves must traverse without the cover that mountain terrain provides. But the connections exist, and the fact that wolves made it to Elko County demonstrates that they are permeable enough to allow dispersal, even if not all dispersers complete the journey. Understanding those corridors and their permeability is one of the most practically important questions in wolf conservation planning for the Great Basin, because corridors that are permeable to individual dispersers may or may not be permeable to the sustained gene flow that a healthy metapopulation requires. A corridor through which one wolf passes once a decade is not the same ecologically as a corridor through which multiple wolves pass in multiple directions across multiple years. The genetic connectivity that prevents inbreeding depression and maintains adaptive capacity in recovering populations requires not just connectivity in theory, but connectivity in practice, meaning actual animals moving in both directions across the landscape regularly enough to produce meaningful genetic exchange. Whether the corridors connecting Nevada to the northern Rockies provide this level of connectivity is a question that current data cannot fully answer, but that the ongoing presence of wolves in Nevada makes possible to study in ways that were not previously available. The conservation community's response to the Nevada wolf documentation has been, as it always is when wolves appear somewhere they were not expected, a mixture of genuine excitement and strategic communication. The genuine excitement reflects the real significance of what the trail camera footage represents. This is an animal that was eliminated from this landscape by direct human action, and that is returning through its own movement, under its own power, navigating a transformed and more hostile landscape than the one its predecessors inhabited, and arriving at a place where it was not expected to arrive yet. There is something legitimately remarkable about that. The strategic communication reflects the awareness that premature celebration can harden political opposition, that images of wildlife biologists expressing joy at wolf presence in ranching country can become fodder for the narrative that wolf recovery is driven by urban sentiment with no regard for rural economic reality, and that the most productive path to wolf establishment in Nevada probably runs through careful relationship building with the livestock community rather than public statements that foreground conservation victory. The livestock compensation programs that have been developed in other wolf states represent one tool for building the kind of tolerance that allows wolf populations to establish and persist. These programs work imperfectly. The confirmation requirements are difficult to meet. The reimbursement rates are often below market value for the animals lost. The administrative burden of documentation falls on ranch operators who are already managing operations with thin margins and limited staff. But they represent a good faith institutional commitment to sharing the costs of wolf recovery with the people who are most directly affected by it. And the states and ranches where these programs operate with the most cooperation tend to be the states and ranches where wolf livestock conflict produces the least political heat. Developing comparable infrastructure in Nevada before wolves are established in numbers that produce regular livestock interactions is wiser than building it reactively after conflict has already created hardened positions. The non-lethal deterrent toolkit that has accumulated over 20 years of wolf livestock management in the Northern Rockies is also relevant to Nevada and has been communicated to livestock operators in the affected counties by NDOW and its federal partners, with varying degrees of uptake. Livestock guardian dogs, a tool as old as pastoralism itself, are effective deterrents against wolf predation when deployed correctly and in sufficient numbers. Range riders, humans on horseback who move through grazing allotments and keep livestock grouped and moving in ways that reduce vulnerability to predation, reduce losses significantly in areas where they operate. Fladry, the line of brightly colored flags that wolves instinctively avoid crossing when it is new and which loses its deterrent effect over time as wolves habituate to it, is a short-term tool with specific applications around calving areas or temporary concentrations of livestock. Electrified fladry, which pairs the visual deterrent with a mild electric shock, retains its deterrent effect longer. These tools do not eliminate predation. They reduce it to levels that most ranchers who have used them in other states describe as manageable, though that word covers a range of experiences that includes ranchers for whom the management burden is genuinely sustainable, and ranchers for whom it represents an addition to an already unsustainable workload. The hunting community's relationship with wolf recovery in Nevada is complicated in ways that differ from the livestock community's relationship. Hunters in Nevada are primarily concerned with mule deer and elk, the species that constitute both the primary game resource of the state and the primary prey base for any wolf population that establishes itself. The concern is that wolves will reduce deer and elk populations to the point where hunting opportunity is diminished, a concern that is supported by the documented experience in parts of the Northern Rockies where wolf predation has been one of several factors contributing to elk population declines. It is a concern that deserves honest engagement rather than dismissal, because the historical baseline for wolf-ungulate dynamics in the Great Basin does not exist in a way that allows precise prediction of what wolf predation pressure would do to Nevada's deer and elk herds. What the data from other wolf-present states shows is that the relationship between wolf predation and ungulate population dynamics is neither as catastrophic as opponents of wolf recovery claim, nor as ecologically neutral as the most optimistic wolf advocates have sometimes suggested. Wolves kill ungulates. In areas of high wolf density, with prey populations already stressed by drought, habitat loss, or hunting pressure, wolf predation can contribute meaningfully to population decline. In areas where prey populations are robust and the landscape supports recovery, wolf predation produces the kind of regulation that large prey populations can absorb without population-level decline, particularly when it is accompanied by the behavioral changes in prey movement that reduce the intensity of grazing pressure in specific areas and improve habitat quality for ungulates across the broader landscape. The relationship is dynamic and context-dependent, which means that honest predictions about what wolf establishment in northeastern Nevada would do to local deer and elk populations require landscape-specific analysis, rather than the application of either the pro-wolf or anti-wolf narrative from other ecosystems. The state's wildlife management infrastructure would need to adapt to wolf presence in several ways that are already being anticipated by people within NIDO and in the academic wildlife biology programs at the University of Nevada. Monitoring capacity would need to expand. The existing camera grid that detected the Elko County wolves was not designed as a wolf monitoring system. It detected wolves incidentally because cameras placed for deer and elk monitoring capture large carnivores when they move through the same terrain. A wolf population particularly one that is growing and moving through new areas of the state, would require a more systematic monitoring approach to track pack structure, territory establishment, prey selection, and livestock interactions in near real time. The genetic sampling infrastructure to identify individuals and track pack membership and population connectivity would need to be maintained at a level adequate to answer the management questions that a resident wolf population generates. The coordination between NDO and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which retains primary management authority over the federally listed species, would need to function smoothly enough to allow rapid response to depredation events and conflict situations, without the jurisdictional friction that has slowed response in some other wolf-present states. The educational infrastructure directed at the public, both the rural public directly affected by wolf presence and the urban public whose political support for wolf recovery is assumed but not always well informed, would need to be developed deliberately rather than reactively. The experience of other wolf recovery states suggests strongly that the public communication environment in which wolf recovery occurs matters enormously to its long-term success. States where wildlife agencies invested early and consistently in honest, balanced communication about what wolf presence means, what it costs, and what it offers, produced a public conversation that, while never free of conflict, was more capable of sustaining productive policy development than states where the communication environment was dominated by the most extreme voices on both sides. Nevada has the advantage of being able to observe that experience and choose which approach to emulate. The ecological opportunity that wolf recovery in Nevada represents is not trivial and deserves to be articulated specifically rather than invoked in the general language of biodiversity or ecosystem health that has become so familiar as to have lost its meaning for many audiences. The mountain ranges of northeastern Nevada are the kinds of landscapes that wolf ecology changes in specific, measurable ways. They have streams and riparian systems that show the signatures of ungulate overbrowsing in the absence of predation risk. They have mule deer populations whose spatial distribution reflects the absence of a coursing predator. They have the structural conditions in which wolf-driven trophic cascades, or at minimum, wolf-driven behavioral shifts in prey populations, could produce ecological changes that would be visible and measurable within a decade of breeding pack establishment. This is not a guaranteed outcome. The Great Basin is not Yellowstone, and the application of Yellowstone's ecological story to every other ecosystem where wolves might recover is a simplification that legitimate ecologists have pushed back against. But the mechanisms are real. The directionality of the effects is understood. The specific expression of those effects in Nevada's specific ecological context is the kind of question that a wolf population in the state would allow researchers to answer. What happened in Elko County in 2021 is, at its most basic level, a story about an animal moving across a landscape that human beings have spent decades trying to understand, manage, and sometimes manipulate in ways that reflect human priorities that do not always align with the landscape's own ecological logic. The wolf did not read the management plans. It did not consult the livestock depredation records from Idaho or the trophic cascade studies from Yellowstone or the political memoranda from state agriculture departments. It followed prey and terrain, and the dispersal imperative that is as fundamental to wolf biology as the pack structure it will eventually need to express that imperative fully. It arrived in Nevada because the landscape, despite everything humans have done to it, and with it, and to the wolf itself, was still connected enough to allow that arrival. That connectivity is fragile. The corridors that wolves are using to move from the northern Rockies into the Great Basin are not protected corridors with managed permeability. They are the spaces between human-dominated areas that happen to remain traversable, for now, by a determined animal willing to cross highways and agricultural valleys and the other obstacles that a century of development has inserted into the landscape. Those spaces are not getting larger. The development pressure on the rural West is not diminishing. The road networks that wolves must cross to move between mountain ranges are not getting less trafficked. The window of ecological opportunity that the current landscape configuration provides for wolf dispersal is not guaranteed to remain open. The documentation of wolves in Nevada is, in this sense, a time-stamped record of a specific ecological moment. It tells us that in 2021, the landscape between the northern Rocky Mountain wolf populations and the Great Basin was still permeable enough for dispersal. It tells us that Nevada's prey base was sufficient to attract and sustain traveling wolves. It tells us that the monitoring infrastructure, however imperfect, was capable of detecting the presence of these animals when they arrived. What it does not tell us is what will happen next, whether the animals documented will find mates, whether they will establish a territory, whether the human community, within whose political and economic landscape they exist, will develop the tolerance and the management infrastructure that population establishment requires, whether the corridors they use to reach Nevada will remain passable for the additional animals that a growing population would need to supply. These are questions that will be answered over the next decade by a combination of wolf biology, landscape change, policy decisions, and the accumulation of individual human choices made by ranchers and hunters and wildlife managers and state legislators and federal judges and conservation advocates and ordinary citizens in Nevada and the states whose wolf populations provide the animals moving south and west into new territory. The answers are not predetermined. The wolf's return to Nevada is not a guaranteed conservation success story. It is a biological opening, an ecological possibility that may or may not be realized depending on what happens at that intersection of animal behavior and human decision-making that defines the recovery of every large carnivore in the modern world. The history of wolf recovery in North America, since the Endangered Species Act created the framework for it, is a history of exactly this kind of contingency. The Yellowstone reintroduction, which is now cited as one of the great successes of American conservation, almost did not happen. It took 2 decades of political and legal struggle to move from the first serious recovery proposals to the physical act of releasing wolves into the park. The wolves that eventually walked out of the acclimation pens at Crystal Creek and Rose Creek in January of 1995 arrived because of court decisions and agency determination and congressional tolerance and public support that assembled over 20 years into the specific configuration necessary to make the moment possible. A different court decision, a different election, a different configuration of political pressure at a different moment would have produced a different outcome. The contingency is not reassuring to people who think of conservation success as inevitable once the ecological rationale is sufficiently demonstrated. It is the accurate description of how large carnivore recovery actually works. Nevada is now part of that contingent history. The trail camera footage from Elko County has created a record that cannot be uncreated. The wolves were there. They are documented. Whatever happens next, the moment of their detection is part of the factual foundation of the state's wildlife history in a way that earlier, unconfirmed reports were not. The nearly century-long absence that preceded their detection is also part of that record. And the comparison between the landscape that exists now and the landscape that existed before the wolves were removed, while imperfect and complicated by all of the other changes that a century of human alteration has produced, is available to anyone who wants to ask what the land looked like with wolves in it, and what it might look like again. The gray wolf is an animal of symbolic weight, so heavy that it sometimes collapses the specific biological and ecological reality beneath it. It has been a symbol of wilderness and of the threat that wilderness poses to agricultural civilization. It has been a symbol of conservation success and of federal government overreach. It has been the subject of children's fairy tales, in which it is a predator of the innocent, and of conservation documentaries, in which it is the ecological savior of broken landscapes. None of these symbolic framings captures what it is, which is an intelligent, social, adaptable large carnivore with a functional role in the ecosystems it inhabits that cannot be fully replicated by any substitute, and that has been documented with increasing scientific confidence.